Greetings, my name is Dr. Falami DeVoe, and you are listening to And the Conversation Continues podcast. This podcast invites you, the listener, to engage in the enlightening and inspiring topics that were featured at Antioch University's Masters of Arts in Individualized Studies colloquia. 3 times a year, faculty, staff, students, and a community gather together virtually to center social justice issues with lived experiences. From learning how to lead and live during COVID-19 to unpacking environmental justice as a human right or centering mental well-being, thought leaders, scholars, and activists shared with the colloquial community a plethora of ideas and perspectives to consider. Well, this left a desire for more conversation, so here we are, and the conversation continues. This podcast seeks to dive deeper into the rich conversations and stories that were shared during those times. On today's show, we are continuing the conversation from the Winter 22 Colloquium, and the Women Shall Lead. The focus of this colloquium was to engage our community in dialogue around the ways in which women lead in their communities and workspaces. One of those presenters, Dr. Nicola Smith-Kea, is joining me today. I am so excited. I am elated. I am grateful to have this sister, my sister, as I affectionately call her, on the podcast. The information that she shared for our Winter 22 colloquium was captivating. It was informative, and it had people wanting more. And so she's here today on The Conversation Continues, and her presentation was entitled Saving a Seat for a Sister, and it truly deserves additional conversation. Now, before we get into talking together, let me share how dynamic this sister is. Her experience and expertise you must pay a close attention to. So Dr. Nicola Smith-Kea considers herself a change agent with a deep passion for gender equity and equality. She holds a PhD in Leadership and Change from Antioch University, where she was my cohort sister, my WEOT sister, and we can talk a little bit about that shortly. And her work and research focuses on the journey of women reaching top policing executive positions and untangling the complex factors that allowed them to succeed or stood in their way. Now, Dr. Smith-Kea has extensive national experience working with a diverse cross-section of law enforcement agencies. She has a deep knowledge and expertise at the intersection of law enforcement, mental health, substance use disorders, and homelessness. She also is focused on recruitment, retention, and inclusion of women in law enforcement, with expertise in female professional advancement to executive leadership positions in law enforcement. She is a scholar practitioner with multiple years of experience in policy, research, and analysis at the international, national, and local level. Dr. Smith-Kea is a court-appointed special advocate, CASA, for Montgomery County, Maryland. And as a CASA, she is a trained volunteer appointed by the juvenile court to advocate for the best interest of abused. Now, let us have a wonderful conversation with Dr. Smith-Kea, and let's take it there. Welcome to The Conversation Continues.
Thank you, Dr. Falami. Happy to be here.
Thank you. I am so excited to continue this conversation. And that's why in coming up with the name for this podcast about a year ago, it really was birthed out of the need to have more conversations with our amazing presenters that we have at our colloquia. And you're one of them now. And so I want for us to just do a brief little snippet for those that were not a part of the colloquium that day to share when you say saving a seat for a sister and talking about women in policing. Can you just share a little bit for those that weren't there? And then we're going to dig into that a little bit more.
You know, I have to give credit for this title to one of my participants for my own research. As you're aware, and as I shared, my focus was on women who got to executive leadership positions in policing. And I intentionally took a positive psychology approach. I wasn't interested in the barriers. I think there's quite a bit of research on why women aren't at the top. And quite frankly, we know why women aren't at the top. But I knew that there were women who got there, and I wanted to understand how they got there. So saving a seat for a sister is really a way to support women, a way to provide guidance to women, a way to help women understand and recognize how they can get to the top of a policing organization.
So, yeah, you talked about in the conversation in your presentation that there's this persistent lag of female inclusion in leadership in policing. Talk to me about that and why is that? Well, first of all, I don't know if you know this, and this maybe you do or not. When did women start really becoming a part of policing? Is there a particular time period when it was really when they started in policing? Can you speak to that at all? And then talk about this lag of female inclusion in leadership.
So women, the inclusion of women in policing is certainly over a couple of years. However, women came into the profession basically taking care of children. So if there were crimes against children, if there were crimes involving abuse of women, that's where the women were focused. That's where the women were put. That's where the women were seen as being important. A fun fact I normally give is we have over 18,000 agencies in law enforcement. For the last 25 or more years, we've only seen 12% women in law enforcement.
12%?
And even more, only 12%.
Wow.
Despite the fact that research supports having women in law enforcement, right? And even more alarming is the fact that there are only about 3% women in top executive positions across 18,000 agencies.
Wow.
That's a problem.
That's a real problem. And what can you attribute that 12%? What is it? What's the ideology? What's the thought processing? If you can speak to that at all, of why is there only 12%?
The profession, and I've written it in my work. It's a white male conservative profession, and it's a situation of, are we allowing anything that looks and sounds different into this profession? And I think there has been a resistance to having difference in the profession. Certainly, we know that there are biases in hiring, there are biases in selection practices, there are biases in recruitment policies. They simply do not cater for women. There are lack of opportunities for women to advance and resistance against women being in the profession. So there's a lot of gender inequity. There's a lot of gender inequality. There isn't an embracing of gender into the profession. And so women are also not involved in the policy decision making. Women are not involved in the writing of policies. And I think it's a perpetual problem in the profession that, again, there's a resistance to women being in the profession, I would argue.
So how do you envision making this? How do you envision this movement? Because you talked about this Save a Seat as a movement, and how do you envision changing the hearts and minds of what you clearly said? It's deeply rooted, these thoughts of not advancing women. So how do you move the needle?
I think there needs to be a lot of conversation, and I'm actually a part of another movement, if you want to call it, called the 30 by 30 initiative. I'm on the steering committee, and a few years ago, two very dynamic women, Chief Yvonne Roman and Maureen McGough, started the 30 by 30 initiative, and they brought a number of women together to really sit and think through how do we advance women in policing. And so we created this initiative called 30 by 30, which is basically getting departments to sign on to make a commitment to increase the number of women recruits in their departments by the year 2030. That's a lofty goal, and we think we're able to do it. So far, I do believe we have over 200 agencies that have signed on to the effort. In the grand scheme of things, that's still a small number across 18,000 agencies, but there's interest. There is a lot of commitment within the departments that have signed on to make this happen. We're seeing a lot more conversation about women in positions of power. I think in the last few years, with the movements that we've seen, whether it be Black Lives Movement or Time's Up or other movements, we see the voices of women being lifted up. We've traditionally seen that women are often silent, and we've seen an increase in conversation, an increase in an acceptance of women in positions. And so the conversation needs to continue. It's going to take time. It's going to take concerted, intentional effort for this change to happen. And I think we have a group of committed women in the profession who are willing to see this move forward.
So what about, and you're working in an urban area, Philadelphia, and what about small town communities, Kentucky or West Virginia, small town communities? How do you get this kind of message out there? How does this become a priority for smaller communities that don't have, say, the same or as much demographics, if you will? So how do you, how do you do that? What are your thoughts about that?
And I can tell you, and when we talk about law enforcement agencies, we consider very large agencies, we consider middle-sized agencies, and we consider small agencies. A lot of those folks signed up are actually mid-sized to small agencies. So the word is getting around. I think there is a realization that something needs to be different. Over the last couple of years with the civil unrest, we hear communities asking for change. We hear communities asking for difference. That difference means policing has to look different and sound different. And so departments are embracing that. In small departments, it's going to be difficult. It's going to be challenging. But how do we find champions for this cause? How do we find allies for this cause? That's going to be important. Small agencies need to see other agencies that look like them, that are similar to them doing this. And so our outreach is to very diverse agencies across the country. We're hoping to start a listening tour for a documentary that was created in the last year or so, Women in Blue. And so we're going to be doing regional tours to have conversations to understand the journey of women in policing, to understand the experience of women in policing, to understand the expectations of women in policing. I can tell you the women who are on the steering committee, and I believe it's around 30 or so, and those who are leading the effort, we try to get into every space possible, national conferences, large and small conferences, to get on the agenda to have these conversations, to have open, frank conversations about how can we reform policing through the way policing looks.
I love that. I love this listening tour. Can you give us an idea of where these cities are going to be? How can someone find out about the listening tour?
So at this moment, we're in the planning stage, and we haven't finalized that yet.
Got it.
But certainly, once that happens, we will be. We're discussing now. We're thinking through communication strategies of how to get the word out.
Yeah.
And once that happens, we'll be blasting as far and wide as possible.
Okay.
So that's just in the initial stage. We're hoping to launch to kick off in March, which is Women's History Month, to have possibly one of the in-person discussions during the month, and then a few following March.
Awesome, awesome. So I want to just now you're giving me so much. I have several different questions, but I want to go back to your dissertation was about the complex journey to women in leadership. So what did you learn from their journey, and what can others learn from that journey or from their journeys?
Oh boy, how long do you have? I learned so much.
You can give me a few snippets, a little bit.
And I think I shared it when I had the conversation at Antioch as well. There was this overwhelming responsibility to tell their stories. And I did interviews with 21 women and 10 other individuals, had over 230 pages of notes that I had to go through. And it was my responsibility to tell their story. And what came out of that was really intriguing for me. Despite the fact that the women had different journeys from their youth to when they decided to become law enforcement officers, they all basically came to this place and are in positions of power because ultimately they wanted change. And that is what really drove them. They wanted to see a difference in the profession. They wanted to see a difference with how the profession treated people in their community. They wanted change overall. But what also became really important in the work that I did was, in order for that to happen, women realized a few things. In order to get to the top, you had to be seen, meaning you had to be visible. People had to know that you were there. People had to know that you are you're doing something different. So visibility was really important. And that's a challenging thing. The accent you're hearing from me is Jamaican. And women typically, we work in the background. We do all the work. We rarely ask for attention or recognition. But what my research found was that is important. Other thing that was... Go ahead.
Just thinking about that, when you think about the ways in which girls are socialized and women are socialized, girls are socialized to, to not sometimes be seen, and not to take up space. And so here, what you're saying, how very important it is in this policing is for women to be visible. And so I'm wondering about, again, I don't want to go on a tangent, but just the mental psyche of women who have been accustomed who socialized into not taking up space, not being seen, how they had the hurdles that they had to overcome in order to be visible.
That's right. I mean, again, coming from the Caribbean, we have a saying that says you should small up your soul. Be as small as possible, work in the background. It's not important, and you should not want to be seen because that's showy, that's pushy. And we need to think about what that is saying to our young girls, our daughters, when we're telling them to be silent. And I think for me also, that was the significance of the title of my work, Saving a Seat for a Sister. It was an intentional and strategic act by a number of women. And I do it when I go to conferences as well. And when I'm around a table as well, I save that seat because that seat allows women to both be seen and heard. Outside of us saving that seat, women are often in the background. Women are not at the table, right? And so it has to be an intentional effort. Being visible has to do with our diversity of experiences and exposures and engagement opportunities. How do we show that if we're in the background? We need to be seen, we need to be heard. So that was a really important part of what I found. The other intriguing thing for me and what came out of my research was, and while disheartening, I wasn't surprised, women had to make opportunities for themselves. Because they weren't given the opportunities. I remember having a conversation with one of my participants who ended up crying, like literally crying, because there are certain elite training opportunities in policing. If you're on track to become an executive, you're expected to go to Northwestern, you're expected to go to to FBI, NA, National Academy, but often women are not given those opportunities. And she paid out of pocket. She paid, I think she said $10,000 out of pocket just to have the opportunity to do that. And so women have recognized that they're not getting the opportunity. And in fact, Black women who were in my study were not getting the same opportunities as their white colleagues either. So they had to find opportunities. They had to make their own opportunities in order to get to where they needed to be. So that was another really important thing that came out. And then the other thing was they had to take chances. They had to take risks. That means being strategic, being courageous, right? It means having grit and determination, which is strengthened by participant resilience. Policing as a profession promotes and favors risk-taking. And it really shuns women who try to step into that space and often attaches these labels to women. And I think that can be seen across professions as well. I think the work, what I found in my research is really transferable to other professions as well. Because again, if women step forward, if we think of a peacock, if women show our feathers, we're often labeled, we're often shunned, we're often told we're trying to be like men. Which is absolutely ridiculous, right? So all that came out in my work. Women wanted change, but they knew they had to be visible. They knew they had to make opportunities, and they knew they had to take chances.
Wow. This is so interesting to me. As I was listening to you talk, and I'm thinking, like, so what's the vision? What vision do you have for women in policing?
Oh boy, I have to be careful what I say, right?
Tell the truth now. Tell the truth. No, but this is something
I want to see more women because it makes a difference.
What does more look like, and what ranks? Like, what does that look like for somebody who has no idea of policing, other than the stories my wife tells?
And I already mentioned what does that look like and what rank. Because for me, it's not just diversity, it's also inclusion. So it's not just getting women in as recruits, and that's a conversation we're having among the 30 by 30 initiative. But how do we get women up the rank and to the top is really important. But you can't be what you can't see. So the importance is really increasing the numbers. That needs to be our focus. But also empowering women. I now work in the Philadelphia Police Department, and a young woman came to me probably a couple months after, and she said, Dr. Nikki, I've been wanting to come to you, but I've been so scared. I know that I'm here talking to you. I'm so happy I came. And I'm like, why were you scared? And that's how, again, we spoke about how we teach our children and our daughters to behave. That's how the women are trained to behave. You stay in the background. You do not approach senior leadership. You do not have conversations. And so how do we change that, right? There's a chief of police who I really respect, Vera Bumpers, in the Houston Metropolitan Police Department. And she has an effort she calls Blue Tabletop, which copies Red Tabletop. And I was invited to that conversation. And that's something that should be happening in every department. We're having intentional conversation with women. Right? And I've heard the statement, why just women? And I said, it's not just women, but that's the fight I'm fighting right now. And it's okay.
Wow.
And if I fight that fight, that then opens up opportunities for other diverse groups. Right? Yep. I recall when I was about to do my dissertation, one of our beloved professors said, why am I just focusing on women? And I said, why shouldn't I?
Absolutely.
What is wrong with me just focusing on women? Absolutely. Men have gotten enough attention.
That's right.
And it's okay. I'm not against men. I'm not against men in the profession. But why don't we, in the year 2022, have more women in policing and certainly more women in positions of power.
Absolutely.
That's what I want to see. I want to see a profession with more equity and with more equitable opportunities. In some countries, in the European countries, there is 50-50, there is parity, right? As small as Jamaica is, we have a higher percentage of women in leadership positions in our policing departments back home. And for the love of me, I cannot understand why this remains acceptable in the United States.
Wow. Yeah, it doesn't make sense. It does make sense. Let me retract that. It makes sense. It's unfortunate, put it like that. It's very unfortunate. Yes. It's very unfortunate. So I had one more question, and I could continue to go on because it's just, my question is, as you know, I talk and give presentations around self-care. How can women in policing, how can as you are moving forward and trying to get women up the ranks, what does that look like in also making sure that they are knowing and learning, being supported in taking care of themselves?
Mm-hmm. So one other thing that really came out as being very important in the journey of these women is to have support. You can't do this on your own. And so that was a really strong point that came out in my research. Women are getting support by different and from different means, from different support systems. Their support is coming in from different forms, from different sources at different times, based on what is needed when, right? So the type of support that is needed, that is sought, that is utilized, was dependent on the situation and where the participant was along their journey. In some situations, mentors were important, but that was not the end all and be all. In other situations, you needed a networking situation. You needed someone to sponsor you. In some situations, you needed your girlfriends. In other situations, you needed your family. So support in general is necessary and needed. And that's something I'm also working with the women in the Philadelphia Police Department and on our 30 by 30 journey to how do we get women to really support each other.
Yes.
I think you're aware, I changed jobs in January of 2021, and I can't believe the year is already gone. And when I left one job and was on break, I decided to start a women's happy hour. And 1 year later, we're still going strong for women at the intersection of law enforcement and behavioral health.
Wonderful.
A colleague, a friend of mine, and I decided to start it because we were both in really challenging spaces in our professional careers and development. And it was a conversation we had, and we said, why not bring these women together? We had no plan, we had no agenda, we committed to making it informal, and 1 year later, it's still going strong. 1 year later, we're helping each other to figure out what we need to do in certain situations.
Yes.
1 year later, we're helping each other to make life-changing decisions, right? So how can we be more intentional about supporting each other, about lifting and highlighting and uplifting each other? I think you mentioned reality when we started with each other to the end.
That's right.
How can we make that a movement?
Absolutely.
Because unfortunately, that's a part of how we grow up as women as well. Stay your own, don't get involved, don't do this, don't do that. We need to change that narrative.
Right.
We need to figure out intentional ways of supporting our sisters, of lifting women up.
Absolutely.
And so that's something that I'm committed to bring. And that's what is, again, you asked about how do they do this? They have to find support systems.
That's right. Thank you. Listen here, that you said all of a word. That is a sermon that you just said, for real. And I so appreciate you returning back to what I said, how you and I we're supporting each other as well as our other sister, Dr. Q, in our journey through finishing our doctorate. And it's so important that we held on to each other. And that's the same thing that you are providing this support, this community for support with no agenda, which is awesome, and that is what I so believe. I mean, we heal in community, we grow in community. And so by doing that, having this space for them, it's just really, a powerful, powerful initiative. So thank you for that. Thank you. This has been wonderful, which I knew that it would be. I enjoy. Every time I hear you speak or we talk about your research, I have more questions, and so it's so needed. This work is so needed. What you're doing, I know you are on demand, so I want to give folks an opportunity to know where they can find you if they need to have you to come in and to speak, or where can folks find you? Social media? Can you share that information with us?
And Dr. Falami, you put me on the spot because I'm not a social media person. So I can tell everyone who's listening, the only place you can find me is LinkedIn.
LinkedIn, that's right. Yes. Mm-hmm.
So if you look for Nicola Smith-Kea on LinkedIn, you'll find me. Bless his soul, we have a communication personnel in the PPD who just this week said, Dr. Nikki, do you think you want a PPD Twitter account? And I said, absolutely not. I have no time for social media. I know it's important. Yeah. I'm going against my own research about being visible because that's the way that people are being visible. Right. But my visibility is on social media, on LinkedIn, and you can find me there. You're free to reach out. I'm very responsive if anyone reaches out. So I look forward to hearing from anyone.
That's right. You are very, very responsive on LinkedIn. And so folks, if they want to get in contact with you, again, her information is Nicola, Nicola, Smith-Kea, Kea. So thank you so much. I appreciate you. I am just so amazed. Continue to uplift you and talk about you and your work as you are moving forward and continuing to save seats for sisters, right? So I invite you to share this podcast with those in your networks and follow the IMA program on Instagram at Antioch University IMA. Until next time, this is Dr. Falami DeVoe, and come join me again as we continue the conversation.